this past week at their big annual meeting. The old guard enjoyed some very decisive victories, and the pretend progressives got, well, blown the fuck out. Today we're going to cruise into their mosh pit and see what happened. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today is Tuesday, June 16th, 2026. This is Roll to Disbelieve, and I'm Captain Cassidy. Thank you for joining me. Holy cow, it is so hot today where I am. It's our first real day of summer heat, and it is brutal. We hit 100 degrees. But I'm trucking along, and I hope you are too, wherever you happen to be. I've noticed a lot of new folks coming in from the YouTube uploads. And hi everyone, I'm glad to see you. Before we get going, I would like to thank my patrons and supporters. You make Roll to Disbelieve possible, and I can't tell you enough how much I love what I do and appreciate your support. You have always been my driving inspiration. Thank you so much. If you'd like to join them, I'd love to have your support as well. Please check out the links at the end of today's write-up. It'll be over at Patreon under Roll to Disbelieve, one word, and also at our official website, rolltodisbelieve.com. Thank you for whatever you decide to do. Every little bit helps enormously. And now, our situation report. Oh, guys, the old guard swept SBC26. 4 years now, the Southern Baptist Convention, or SBC, has endured a bitter factional fight. I have called their two factions the Old Guard and the Pretend Progressives. They don't really have formal names, and often their members will not announce which faction they belong to. But there's not a lot of difference between them. Both of them are deeply conservative, and neither really wants to see the SBC change nature over much. But I find that the Old Guard is slightly more honest about its goals and its nature. These two factions crystallized around the SBC's sex abuse crisis, which journalists called abuse of faith. These journalists uncovered hundreds of victims of sex abuse and many dozens of predatory SBC ministers. And the denominational leaders, they allege, knew about it and did nothing. Now, the pretend progressives act like they care very deeply about sex abuse and about the victims of these predatory ministers. Meanwhile, the old guard just snarls that it's not the SBC's problem, that individual churches need to deal with the situation. However, it's worth noting that the old guard has solidly lost just about every major skirmish they have started with the pretend progressives since about 2018. At the annual meetings, the flocks consistently voted for pretend progressive candidates and causes. Well, this week at SBC26, the 2026 annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Old Guard's losing streak finally came to a decided end. This hardline faction swept SBC26, winning both the presidential election and the first of two required votes opposing women pastors. This year's meeting marks a huge change for the SBC. They've abandoned what made them strong long ago, choosing instead to purity spiral. Worse, the flocks are putting their trust in the exact same zealots who caused their decline 20 years ago in the first place. And those zealots didn't learn a thing from the experience. They want to stage a second schism in the SBC. They think it'll end the denomination's membership hemorrhage. As a commenter put it earlier, just trust me, bro. Just one more conservative resurgence, bro. That's all I need. Yeah, sure. But that's not even the wildest part of the news. Oh, wait until we talk about the president they elected. Just wait. This is amazing. Today, I'm going to show you what happened at SBC26 and what it means for the SBC and maybe the rest of us too. First, let's start with an overview of the annual meeting. This year's SBC annual meeting was in Orlando, Florida, and it enjoyed really high attendance. Any annual meeting in a southern state usually does, but man, this attendance level was unheard of. They haven't had this many people at an annual meeting since 1995. This time around, 21,000 plus people attended, with 11,692 of them being messengers. Messengers are the ones who can actually do the voting on SBC business. So the other people, probably wives or other people associated with the church. Churches can send 2 to 12 messengers to the annual meeting, depending on how lavishly they contribute to the cooperative program, the CP. The CP is super important. It funds denomination-wide projects, like seminaries, missionaries, church plants, that kind of thing. And as usual, most of the attendees came from nearby states. Over 2,000 of them came from Florida alone. Yeah, the Southern Baptist Convention has always been pretty, Southern. In their presidential vote, Willie Rice won against Josh Powell. We'll get to Rice in a little bit. As for Powell, we briefly discussed him recently when I talked about costly worship. He's in favor. Otherwise, I've never heard of him. He was solid old guard in his campaign, though. He chose to focus more on the Great Commission. Evangelicals think Jesus told them to evangelize the entire world, and that this was his Great Commission to them. Now, he doesn't want to reform the SBC to make sex abuse less, inevitable. He wants to focus on the Great Commission. In fact, and as we see old guard guys do all the time, he flat rejected the idea that the SBC even has a sex abuse crisis at all. There isn't much difference between the candidates. Powell didn't support Al Mohler's amendment thing. Rice did. We'll talk about the amendment in a minute. Powell didn't think the SBC needed a second conservative resurgence. Willie Rice vocally supported the idea. That's about it. Their similarity was reflected in the voting itself. It was a close election. Rice got 57% of the votes. Powell got 42%. Here's the interesting part. Remember I said there were 11,000 some people who could vote in the SBC annual meeting? Only 9,000 of them participated in this election. They also voted on an amendment to ban female pastors. That passed its first round with nearly 75% of the messengers' votes. Notably, only about 8,000 of them participated in that one. Most of the SBC26 meeting was taken up with beloved old guard causes. Missionaries, church planting and church starts, evangelism. The old guard consistently describes this focus as part of their hoped-for renewal of the SBC. At these meetings, they also vote on what are called resolutions and amendment proposals. All of the ones up for voting passed. This year, the most important one was Al Mohler's constitutional amendment. Al Mohler is an old guard stalwart. He runs one of the SBC's seminaries. He is a made man of that first schism. He called his constitutional amendment the Truth and Unity Amendment, and it specifically slammed the door shut on women wanting to be pastors. They're hoping it'll become an amendment to the SBC's constitution, and from there, become part of how churches are evaluated as members or potential members of the SBC. A church has to be in cooperation with the SBC to be a member of it, and most especially to send messengers to the annual meetings. Getting an amendment like this passed has been a huge project for the old guard. They first tried to do it with the Law Amendment, LAW. It passed its first vote in 2023, failed the second in 2024. They tried again to run it in 2025, but it failed then too. But the margin of failure was interesting here because it kept getting smaller. Mohler's version of this amendment is a lot more strict and definitive than the Law Amendment was. It rigidly defines what it calls the function of a pastor, not just the title of pastor itself. Other amendments didn't define the function of a pastor, and that gave churches a little bit of wiggle room. Like if they didn't call the woman a pastor, they could still let her do pastor stuff, which to the SBC means teaching and preaching to men. And, the hardliners are very upset about that wiggling. They want utter control over these supposedly autonomous churches. Autonomous? Yeah, right. Even this resolution's opponents tend to oppose the idea of women being pastors. They just don't think an amendment to their official constitution is really necessary, because their Baptist Faith and Message 2000, which is their creedal statement, BFM they call it already forbids women to be pastors. And the fact that the SBC has already been kicking out churches with women pastors, like Rick Warren's famous Saddleback Church a few years ago, that proves that they don't really need the constitutional amendment. So why bother? Nonetheless, the amendment passed 74.7% of the vote in favor. And if it passes again next year with a 2/3 vote, it becomes canon. And there were some other resolutions passed. There's one about Christian nationalism, claiming that America's founders, quote, comprehended the importance of Christianity to the framing and flourishing of the new republic, unquote. Can't imagine why they wanted to pass that. They're also targeting the disabled and their families for evangelism and church attendance. That'll be great news to the disabled, I'm sure. They officially oppose medical assistance in dying. They oppose violence done for political reasons. That's the Charlie Kirk assassination there, I'm sure. They stand against anti-Semitism. They support immigration laws that are orderly and credible, they said. They're also reaffirming that they much prefer in-person gathering to online church attendance. Not surprised, bet people tithe more when they're in the church physically. They're also celebrating bivocational and volunteer pastors. Bivocational is an interesting term, and it describes a really interesting phenomenon in SBC churches. It means pastors with a day job outside the church. Almost always, almost without exception, they're doing it because the church can't afford to pay them a living wage. There's definitely some of these bivocational pastors who feel called by Jesus or whatever to do it, but the vast majority of them do not want to be bivocational. They want to be fully paid by the church. Overall, I would say this year's meeting was a big success for the old guard. They got everything they wanted, and the pretend progressives were not even really very visible. And one topic didn't come up at all: sex abuse. Yeah, the SBC's ongoing sex abuse crisis. Yeah, still happening. They're not doing anything about it. Aside from one side panel that talked about sex abuse prevention, nothing official really got discussed about that crisis. The SBC leaders were radio silent, but their silence spoke volumes. Now we know for sure the SBC is completely, utterly done with pretending to care about the many victims of SBC ministers. Gee, I sure hope SBC members are kind of listening to that message. It's not a subtle hint anymore. It's the reality of where the SBC is now. I guess it's possible that the reason the old guard scored so many wins is they just drove out all the pretend progressive aligned people. For years, as I've been watching the votes creep ever and ever closer to old guard wins, I've also been hearing about former SBC members that talk about having left the denomination. I guess this year they just hit critical mass. Now we're going to talk about the Willie Rice situation. And it is a situation. This was amazing. When I heard about who won the election, I shrieked like a little girl. I did. It was downright surreal news. And yet, it fits so perfectly with exactly who and what the old guard are. Willie Rice first ran for SBC president in 2022, and at the time, I pegged him as a pretend progressive. Clint Presley, who is a pretend progressive himself, who became SBC president in 2025, was the one to nominate him. And at the time, he definitely was on board with the pretend progressives. Here's what Willie Rice said about sex abuse back then. Quote, "We must respond with transparency, courage, and, as necessary, deep contrition to the sexual abuse crisis." See, used the C word, he did. Continuing, "God is watching, and so is our mission field. We cannot dodge or obfuscate our responsibilities at this moment. We are all awaiting the guidepost report and the report of the Sexual Abuse Task Force. I am hopeful that it will provide us a way forward, but it will be important that our leaders accept this challenge head on in a way that restores trust and confidence and treats people everywhere with the dignity and respect they deserve." Unquote. Sounds real nice, don't it? But Willie Rice was hiding a dreadful secret, an optics nuclear blast. In the church he pastored, he had ordained a guy called Jeff Ford to be one of his deacons. And he did this knowing full well that Ford had been credibly accused in 2005 of sexually abusing one of his students. Ford was a teacher, and he allegedly began grooming this girl before she hit 18, then sexually abused her after the big birthday. Because he didn't actually do the sex until she was 18, his state couldn't charge him for any crimes. But she was still a student of his, she still should have been completely off limits, and her mom was infuriated and blew the whistle on him. At the time, Jeff Ford's pastor was a guy called Tom Buck. And when he found out about what had happened, Tom Buck handled it pretty well. In his words, he drove Jeff Ford down to the cop shop so he could confess. Now, though, years and years later, here he is, a lieutenant to one of the most hard-line guys of the old guard, Tom Askell, who was also running for the SBC presidency against Willie Rice. Now Jerry Ford was Rice's problem. So Tom Buck called Willie Rice up to talk about Jerry Ford's past. In response, Rice decided to take another look at the situation, he said. Eventually, Rice not only removed Ford from the deacon position, but also, after a lot of dithering, stepped down from the presidential race. Ed Litton ended up winning, and the old guard attacked him for it immediately. But here's the funny part. Afterward, Rice began to distance himself from the pretend progressives. He began to push back against sex abuse reform, which was the big project of that faction. If you hear anyone in the SBC disavowing the sex abuse crisis, that's a tribal marker of them being old guard. So yeah, it signaled his pivot to his factional enemies. The next year, 2023, Rice announced that he would be backing another big old guard leader, Mike Stone, for that year's presidential election. Mike Stone's awful. I mean, Tom Askell's definitely a zealot and a weirdo, but Mike Stone, he is vindictive. At one point, he blamed Russell Moore for wrecking his presidential chances and tried to sue him. Only a lot of mockery made him rethink that idea. Now, this announcement that Willie Rice supported Mike Stone was, shocking. The site church leaders called it somewhat surprising, which might be the understatement of the year. But here's what Rice wrote on his website about Mike Stone. Quote, "Such an announcement would have been unthinkable for both of us a short time ago. I wish the status quo were an option. It's not. The sexual abuse reform movement began with the best of intentions, at least for most of us. But I now believe that movement, as currently engineered, threatens the very fabric of our fellowship. I didn't sign up for left-wing feminist critical theory, cancel culture, politics. I didn't sign up for leaked emails, taped conversations, endless lawsuits, and a character assassination. Gee, I wonder whose character he's objecting to. A movement that should have united Southern Baptists to attack a problem has instead divided us into attacking each other." Unquote. And with that announcement, he became an old guard guy. The next year, 2024, he posted a bizarre essay on the Center for Baptist Leadership, mega old guard site. And there he expressed relief that he hadn't become the SBC president while he was still pretend progressive. Now he says, those efforts were politicized and weaponized. This year, he not only rejected sex abuse reform more vocally than ever, but he called the effort a cultural riptide and a drift that had all but destroyed Southern Baptist unity. This is a really confusing pivot. It's an incredible turnaround, and I really don't understand why he did it. There's not a charitable read I can give of this situation. There are certainly some very uncharitable reads I can give, though. Over at Baptist News Global, Mark Wingfield, the editor there, has characterized Tom Buck's involvement in this whole Willie Rice, Jeff Ford situation as the right thing in a very difficult situation. With all due respect to Wingfield, I think he's a decent person. I disagree, though. Tom Buck eats, lives, and breathes old guard ambition. He is an angry, controlling, vitriolic man, and he is a product of the SBC's incredibly dysfunctional authoritarian system. He only wants to profit from that system. I've seen him get all fluttery over the idea of becoming an SBC president himself one day. Oh, he just about blushed like a girl getting the prom queen nod. No way, no how did this guy involve himself in an SBC election with only pure motives. And now the guy he helped destroy in 2022 is completely on his side? And he hasn't attacked him? This is odd. And there's this, too, about that pivot. A few days ago, Rice denied that there was any kind of, quote, cover-up at the highest levels, meaning a cover-up of sex abuse in SBC churches. Here's the problem. We already know that there is one, and that there was one, and that it was there for decades. Denominational leaders maintained a full database of the accusations. Rice also describes the lackluster stabs at reform that the SBC has made as some meaningful reforms. I'd like to know if those meaningful reforms are in the room with him, because I haven't seen anything out of them that I could call meaningful. Rice's pivot could just be as simple as him reading the writing on the wall, realizing the pretend progressives were done with him. His past shielding Jeff Ford like he did, appointing him to deacon? Oh, no way. The optics were too terrible. They would never sponsor him again. He might have recognized that and realized that the old guard were getting closer and closer to their dreams. They were a more certain bet, so he aligned himself as needed. It's not terribly charitable, no, but it does fit the data that we have. He may complain about the reform efforts from the pretend progressives. He may call them politicized, weaponized, but the old guard is 10 times worse. And part of what makes them worse is that they are far better organized, far more cohesive as a group, and way nastier to their enemies. To conclude our post-mortem of SBC26, I'd like to share something that was kind of funny about this year's annual meeting. After firmly destroying the illusion of church autonomy for member churches, after pushing forward a purity spiral amendment, after ignoring sex abuse for what is likely forever, these guys seriously think that they are getting back to what's important to the SBC, recruitment. They think this push for doctrinal purity will let them get back to focusing on evangelism, church starts, missions. Nope, ain't gonna happen. They may indeed see an uptick in membership. That is a possibility now. There's a lot of unaffiliated right-wing churches that might join up as a result. But the overall trend is very clear. The conservative resurgence they had last time was a schism that ran from about the 1970s to about the 1990s. It was over by 2000. That lost them almost 2,000 churches and started them on a downward spiral of membership loss that still hasn't even plateaued. The hardliners have always hand-waved away the failure of their resurgence. In 2004, Paige Patterson himself, one of the two main architects of the entire movement, compared his beloved schism to the cleanup around Chernobyl. I shit you not. He said it might take 20 years to undo the damage that he thought liberal domination had caused. Well, now it's been 22. They are less liberal than ever, and the flocks still haven't seen any of that movement's promises delivered. But the old guard is sure one more conservative resurgence will do the trick. Just one more. That's all they need. Just one more, bro. And when that fails as well to bring worldwide revival to this struggling denomination, I do wonder what they'll suggest next. I'm thinking a third one. Yeah, they just need a third one. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you liked that. Next up, speaking of the SBC, a former leader in the SBC, Russell Moore, says he doesn't debate atheists. He's about 12 years too late for that one. But Fine, we'll find out why next time. Until then, this is Captain Cassidy signing off. I hope you all have a great midweek, and please stay cool if you're in a hot area, and we'll see you soon.